I want to talk about The Legend of Zelda Remakes. I think this conversation is important not just because we're likely to go into the next cycle of remakes, but also due to the new wave of Zelda fans that will be trying to play the original games. Aside from that, remakes are often used to tide people over between the long development cycles of new entries. They were especially prominent in the 6-year gap between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild, with Wind Waker HD, Majora's Mask 3D, and Twilight Princess HD. In fact, A Link Between Worlds began development as a remake of A Link to the Past, so we almost had 4 remakes between these mainline games. Now that the next Zelda game is in development, we're likely to see remakes to bridge that gap between now and then. I also wanted to make this video as almost a little summary on how I feel about each of the remakes, not only to compare them to each other, but also for the sake of future videos. The next Zelda games which I'll be making a video on all have remakes. I might talk about the remakes of these games a little bit during those videos, but I don't want to compare them or spend too much time on them, so that's what this video is for. We're going to spend some time on the main Zelda remakes, looking at what they changed, what was improved, what wasn't well received, and how the philosophy on Zelda remakes has seemingly changed over the years. So let's get right into it. The first remake of the 3D Zelda games was Ocarina of Time 3D, which released on the 3DS in 2011. This game is probably the one I would call the gold standard of 3D Zelda remakes. Not just because it was so well received, but I'd say the degree to which it changed Ocarina of Time was perfect for when it came out. A significant visual upgrade was given to the game in an attempt to modernize it, with new models, animations, and textures. Link himself earned a huge upgrade, with 3 times the number of polygons to his models, new stances when enemies are nearby, and, taking from the later 3D entries, looks towards objects of interest. Hyrule itself also got a huge facelift, not only with new lighting and textures, but some parts of it also had changes to the terrain to make it less flat. They also introduced a variety of new things for the game's accessibility. Sheikah stones were added to give guidance if the player is stuck at any point through little hint videos. Without giving away too much, a player that has no idea what to do next can still be given a little push into the right direction. Many little changes were put into the game to really make this remake something special, whether it was added details to the villages, improved cutscenes, or even the entirely new boss rush mode. There were some changes that fans didn't like, especially the final boss being more visible than he was before, but overall the changes really did help to improve on the original game. A big part of this was Grezzo. This team worked alongside Nintendo to bring back this game and were very willing to implement changes. Of course, there were a fair few things that Aonuma himself wanted to change, especially the Water Temple. The Water Temple has always been the most complained about part of the game, often being far too difficult and irritating for many players and stopping some from finishing the game entirely. The 3D remake had 2 significant changes that made it that much more tolerable. Firstly, the iron boots are much easier to use. Now that they're an item, you can easily switch them on and off as you move around the dungeon, rather than having to go into the menu every time. The dungeon itself was also made easier, with markings on the wall that let the player know exactly how they are changing the water level at each part, so that they don't end up messing everything up and need to constantly backtrack. This kind of change is important when remaking an old game. You have to remember that you're not erasing the original game, so I don't think there should be any hesitation in changing the parts of the game that people dislike, especially if it's something that stopped them from carrying on. The skills that video game players have has changed over the past 20 years. Even during development of the remake, their playtesters came across barriers that the original development team found surprising. What was also a great choice was including the Master Quest. Master Quest is a mirrored version of the game where Link takes double damage from enemy attacks, but most importantly, the dungeons themselves are altered to be slightly more difficult, with no access to Sheikah hints this time around. The original Master Quest could be obtained with some versions of Wind Waker on GameCube, mainly these were limited pre-order versions of it. It wasn't easy to get hold of a Master Quest copy, and many Zelda fans didn't get to experience it. So by having Master Quest available in this remake, not only is the game a great way for new fans to experience Ocarina of Time, but old fans can finally have a chance at playing a more challenging version. There was a good reason to get this version for both old and new fans. The reason I call Ocarina of Time 3D the gold standard of Zelda remakes is because it brought back an incredible game, but changed enough of it that it stood strong against other titles coming out at that time. It was visually on par with other 3DS games, had significantly improved controls, and offered changes so parts that the current generation of players may find unintuitive would no longer cause them to be completely stuck and stop playing. So while things had been changed, a kid playing Ocarina of Time on 3DS could have a similar experience to what a kid playing Ocarina of Time on the N64 may have had. During the Wii U era, when the next Zelda game was early in development, Nintendo was experimenting with various different art styles to decide on what would be next. One method they used was trying to put previous Zelda games into HD to see what looked best. Wind Waker stood out significantly, which is why Breath of the Wild adopted a cel-shaded art style. During this testing, Nintendo decided that Wind Waker in high resolution looked too good not to release as a full game, and thus Wind Waker HD was released in 2013. This remake attempted to bring the spotlight back onto cel-shaded Zelda, with a whole load of other changes alongside it. The headline changes to this game are, of course, the graphical improvements. Higher resolution, better textures, the lot. The one thing people talk a lot about with this remake is the bloom effect, saying it clashes with the cel-shaded art style. In fact, this was complained about before the release of the game a lot, to the point where it was tuned down before the final release. That didn't stop all the complaints. But the main reason this clash exists is because the cel-shaded art style makes the game look like a cartoon come to life, but the bloom effect tries to emulate more realistic lighting. I don't think it's enough of a clash that it ruins the game. There's certainly parts of this remake I don't personally love, especially with how fuzzy the character models themselves can look, but there's no denying that a lot of effort was put in. The sky and the sea really pop with new effects and textures added throughout. The lighting also got a huge boost with more defined lighting between bright areas and shadows. Updating Wind Waker graphically is challenging because the original is almost considered timeless. You could release the original with higher resolution now and it wouldn't look too out of place. One thing that's common in almost all of the 3D Zelda remakes is ironing out parts of the game that were overly tedious. Every 3D Zelda game has parts that pretty much no one looks forward to, so these remakes gave the games a chance to iron them out and make the whole experience more fun and streamlined. Wind Waker HD had a fair few of these. In the original, the sailing mechanic would eventually get quite annoying, especially when you weren't doing mainline quests and going from one dungeon to another, but instead exploring the sea. Every time you wanted to change direction, you'd have to pull out the Wind Waker, play a song, and choose a direction. While there were tweaks that made changing the wind direction easier, they also added in the Swift Sail. This is an item you can get pretty early on in the game if you're looking for it, and make sailing significantly less annoying. Not only does this increase the speed of the boat, but it will change the direction of the wind as you're turning. This especially helps in making the Triforce quest that much easier, which is famously the most annoying part of the game. This quest was also given further changes to it to make it less tedious. For those that don't know, the Triforce quest had you search for 8 shards of the Triforce across the Great Sea. To do this, you had to look for 8 Triforce charts, which could be on any island, have them all translated by Tingle, which cost an obscene amount of rupees, and then salvage the pieces using the charts. The remake attempted to streamline this by having only 3 of the pieces requiring charts, with the other shards just being in the chests you would originally find the charts in. The original intention of this quest was to make players explore the sea and all it had to offer, but for those that just wanted to play through the main game, this was a huge interruption in the game's pacing, so while it's not the best fix they could have done, I think most players appreciated the streamlining. The reception to this upgraded version of Wind Waker was pretty well received across the board. This was one of those Zelda games that many players hadn't had the chance to play before, so this was a great way to experience the game. The anticipated remake for Majora's Mask released in 2015 following the success of Ocarina of Time 3D, and was also developed by Grezzo. This is essentially the same upgrade given to Ocarina of Time, but arguably a touch more substantial. There are of course the big graphical improvements, with the new models and textures all over the place, as well as some of the new animations for the main 3 transformations. This game had a lot of little changes, and one of them is how some of the masks can be earned. For example, the stone mask, which makes you imperceptible to certain enemies, is now found in the Pirate's Fortress, which is where it's easily the most useful place to use it. It also means that part of the Pirate's Fortress has to be played through without it. You can't just get it beforehand and blast through the entire thing. People argue it makes it too easy to find and makes the Pirate's Fortress less engaging, but most people playing the game for the first time probably won't know that helping Shiro makes the Pirate's Fortress easier. This change also allows people to engage with the side quest at the time when it's most useful. You also still have to use the Lens of Truth to see him, and then he needs to be given a red or blue potion, so in no way is the stone mask just handed to you, it's just moved to what is perhaps a more appropriate spot. Side quests were a really important part of what made Majora's Mask special, so the multiple changes implemented here actually make them a lot easier to access and fully complete. Firstly, the Bomber's Notebook. Not only can it no longer be missed, being given to you by the Happy Mask salesman after enough progress, but the amount of detail inside it is incredibly helpful. The little Bomber's gang will now relay rumours to you, which are essentially hints that lead you to the various side quests that reward you with things such as masks and heart pieces. They'll only tell you rumours about quests you have not yet completed, and all are recorded within your notebook. The notebook itself is essentially a live schedule of the activities of different NPCs, allowing you to track what's happening. You can also add alarms to let you know about certain events you want to interact with. One song that can be learned in the game is the Song of Double Time, which originally skipped the day ahead by 12 hours. The remake changed this so that after playing the song, the player can choose how many hours within the day they want to skip. This makes side quests so much more enjoyable, allowing you to focus on that one quest and skip to the times of day that you need to be around for. As I mentioned before, Majora's Mask has some of the best side quests in the series, and it helps it to make the game that much more special. These changes alone make the side quests more enjoyable, especially on a replay. All of the 4 main bosses also receive changes to them, some being far more significant than others. These fights are not liked by all, mainly because people liked the bosses originally and didn't want them to be different. But it's hard to argue that they're actually worse across the board, and I would argue a fair few of them are quite a bit better. The main change to the bosses is the addition of a big red eyeball weakness that they now all have. This change was made not only for gameplay purposes, but also to improve the narrative, showing how Majora's influence exists across Termina. The eyeball additions also arguably made the bosses feel more similar to other Zelda bosses, giving them a very clear weakness that you had to expose and attack. Not everyone liked this change, as people liked that you could attack these bosses anywhere rather than having to go for a big blinking weak spot. Personally, I appreciate what they were going for here. Each of the bosses also got individual changes to them. The changes were mainly made to incorporate the mask's transformations more. Adolwa is now a lot less predictable when playing as normal Link, but significantly easier to fight as Deku Link, with the big eyeball weakness being easier to access from the sky. Originally, Adolwa was harder to fight as Deku Link, which didn't really fit the game's ongoing theme of each dungeon relating to a mask transformation. On the other hand, this change made the boss a bit too easy, but considering it's the game's first boss, I don't think it's a major issue. Goat, or the Goat boss, he had this really annoying attack where he could turn around and shoot you with lightning with complete precision. This move was changed so he will only use it if he gets much further ahead, meaning the player is rewarded for being able to stay on Goat's tail. The third boss battle, Georg, or George, has been given an entirely new second phase, which takes place underwater, making it a bit more of an interesting fight. The original fight with Georg was an incredibly underwhelming one, where you would just shoot him with an arrow then go underwater to follow up your attacks. The addition of this second phase makes the boss way more engaging and takes advantage of the Zora mask much better. The twin mold boss in the Stone Tower Temple has been completely changed. The Giant's Mask was one you could find inside the temple to make this boss easier, but wasn't required. In the remake, the mask is now given to the player halfway through the fight, splitting it into 2 phases, both without and with the Giant's Mask. This stops the boss from being made into a joke if you found the Giant's Mask, instead making it a necessary part of the fight. The moveset with the mask is also completely reworked, having Link punch the giant worm to death, swinging it around and slamming it into the ground. These boss fights were changed to be a lot more logical than before, with actual steps the player needs to take in order to expose the weak spot, rather than just attacking any part of the boss they can, with or without the mask transformations. I can understand why some people don't like these changes, because the bosses are significantly different, yet I still think these changes make the bosses feel a lot more like Zelda bosses, and a lot more fun to engage in. This doesn't mean the remake didn't have changes that were definitely bad. The changes that were made to Zora Link are universally disliked. Swimming controls were altered to have a faster and slower version of it, but in order to swim quickly, you have to use your magic meter. This means that if you run out of magic, you won't be able to swim around fast, which ends up becoming really frustrating, preventing you from easily swimming around the Great Bay. I understand why these changes were made, as they made swimming around the tighter corridors a lot easier, but that came at a significant cost. It also didn't work great for the remake itself. To swim quickly, you need to hold both the A and R button on the 3DS, meaning you couldn't use the camera controls very easily while swimming. Despite this very much hated change, and a few other changes people don't like, the remake had many good changes, much like Ocarina of Time 3D. Every change had an intention behind it, whether it's to make things more logical for new players, or to make side quests more enjoyable to engage in. Grezzo really put a lot of effort into trying to make this game more balanced and accessible. Not all the changes are liked, but considering how many changes were made to the game, the fact that only a few are universally disliked is still an achievement. The second remake to launch on Wii U was Twilight Princess HD, which was made to tide us over until the release of Breath of the Wild. Compared to previous set of remakes, this game did not receive too many changes. Firstly, there's the aesthetic changes of the game. The main issue with this is that while it did have visual upgrades, they were just upgrades. Unlike the 3DS remakes that were built upon new models, Twilight Princess HD uses the same models as the original. This does sometimes stand out and age parts of the game, as you had these higher resolution textures put on top of low polygon models. Some parts of the game do therefore stand out as a bit odd looking. The part that really reminds me the most of this is when Link pulls the Master Sword. When replaying the remake, I always find his fingers really freaky looking. In the original, this is barely noticeable, probably because this scene gives one of the closer looks at Link's model. There's a lot here that shows the game's age, especially the polygons. Because of the higher resolution, the polygons are more clearly defined and, at least to me, make things look less smooth. Aside from the actual models, the game does look a lot better than the original. It just has more colour and character to it that was drowned out a lot in the original. The new textures are also great, which include a lot of added detail to them, not just higher resolutions. For example, Castletown had these engravings which you could barely make out. In the HD version, these have been completely redone and show very different things. These don't make any sense within the lore at all, but I don't really think it matters. It's just nice that they put effort into little things like this. So while they still use the older models and that's not great, the game does overall look much better. The only thing I wish they did upgrade was the polygon count, at least on some of the more important characters. The character models are the part that ages the game the most. Even if this was only done for Link and Wolf Link, that would have been something. The game's prologue was also changed. This part of the game where Link completes a series of tasks in Orden Village was criticised for years for being far too long and tedious. A common defense for this was that the intro makes you understand Link's life as a teenage farmer in a common village before transitioning into the more epic adventure. This remake managed to cut the intro down in a way where the player still feels the kind of mundane life that Link has, but it no longer overstays its welcome, at least not as much as the original does. The Wolf Link sections of the game are arguably the parts that get the most criticism. I never fully agreed with how much people said this ruined the game, considering it was half of the first 3 dungeons quests, and that's it. Even so, the Tears of Light that you needed to find were cut down by a quarter, with less of them being off route down a straight path. Now they're even shorter, but I'm personally glad they weren't cut entirely. There are of course other additions. An entirely new combat dungeon for Wolf-Link was added, but annoyingly this was locked behind Amiibo, which despite being lucky enough to have one myself, I don't like this decision at all. The Poe Lamp was also added to make that side quest where you gather all the Poe souls easier. The map also got additional details added to it, so it was easier to find things on the map. And one of the best changes they made was speeding up climbing and swimming animations, because these were unnecessarily slow in the original. Amongst all of the good, there are other little changes that were made that I'm not the biggest fan of. Midna now has a reflection. In the same way she acts as Link's shadow, I always saw her having no reflection as an intentional way to show that the Twilight do not interact with light in the same way, hence having no shadow. This change seems more like an oversight than an intentional change. But the thing I liked the absolute least was the Miiverse stamps replacing so many of the treasure chests in the game, and they never really feel well placed. You can put a ton of effort into getting a chest and get rewarded with a stamp. Back in 2016, these were a bit annoying, and playing it now when they're completely useless can be an absolute slap in the face. Overall, much like Wind Waker HD, Twilight Princess HD is the version I prefer to play. I just wish it was easier to play. All remakes up to this point are incredibly hard to get hold of officially, because they can only be played on the Wii U and 3DS. This is irritating enough for me, but considering how many new Zelda fans were made from the success of Breath of the Wild, it's unfortunate that these updates can't be easily accessed. Wind Waker on the GameCube can now be played via Nintendo Switch Online with a higher resolution, and this is nice, especially for those that prefer the original version. But for those that like the changes put into the remake, or want something that looks more modern, you're out of luck unless you already have a Wii U or are willing to emulate. It's likely that Twilight Princess will release on GameCube Collection before they port the remake, and while this would be great, I do hope we will see the return of these remakes soon. There is one classic 3D Zelda you can still get a hold of. The latest 3D Zelda remake was Skyward Sword HD, which released in 2021. Each remake seemed to change less and less things about each game, and this one is the strongest offender. The motion controls in this game are a downgrade. Before we talk about that, there is something else that I want to get to first with the original Wii game. For some people, the motion controls worked fine, but for others, they were abysmal. Why was there this big difference? I couldn't tell you for certain, but one experience I had, which I've never really heard anyone talk about, was the difference between the Wii Motion Plus remote and the Wii Motion Plus extension. I got the game with a golden Wii Remote Plus, and when playing, I essentially had no problems. A friend of mine, who was also playing the game at the time, told me that they were stuck on a boss and just couldn't hack the motion controls. I went round their house at some point the next weekend to help them out, and I struggled. They did not have a Wii Motion Plus remote, but had an extension on the bottom. Now I might completely be misunderstanding the tech, but if you're holding the Wii Remote in the center and swinging it by flicking your wrist, the Wii Motion Plus extension could end up moving in the opposite direction, causing things to go wrong. Only by holding the remote much lower would I have gotten better accuracy. Now if I'm wrong about that, do let me know, because this has been something that's been in my head for 14 years. Anyways, I found the motion controls to actually be enjoyable when using a built-in Wii Motion Plus remote. With the announcement of the remake, I was optimistic because the Joy-Cons were more similar to the built-in remotes, even being a little smaller, which might improve accuracy. I was not correct. In the original version on the Wii, the sensor bar was used to constantly recenter the controls so that the gyro actions wouldn't completely throw you off center. So, while the Switch's Joy-Cons have the technology to replace Wii Motion Plus, they do not have the ability to recenter themselves. So why does that make it worse? The best example I can use is using an item with the pointer. Let's say you take out your slingshot to aim and move the Joy-Con around. When you're done using the item and put it away, you can end up with your sword being pointed strongly in one direction rather than the center. But where this is worse is on the other way round. If you're swinging your sword around in combat, then pull out an item, it will start moving strongly in one direction and throwing you off completely. This did not happen in the original. So the solution they implemented was making one of the 4 main buttons a recenter button, which makes whatever way you're holding the Joy-Con the new center point. This is the button that you will likely press most of the game. Every time you're using the motion controls for a different purpose, you have to press this recenter button. It starts out incredibly annoying. I did eventually get used to it, but I basically had to teach myself to press this button immediately every time I pulled out an item, put one away, or started combat. There's also the graphical changes. Firstly, Skyward Sword of course got a resolution upgrade, the exact same as Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess, with its specific art style and detailed textures, looked much better with a higher resolution, but the main reason that Twilight Princess looked better was because of the new textures that were added into the HD version. The parts where Twilight Princess does not look good is when the higher resolution highlights the polygon count. When it comes to Skyward Sword HD, I feel that the higher resolution can act against it here also. Strangely enough, there are parts of the models that have been given additional polygons, but the models are not remade from scratch. Rather, polygons were added in some places like parts of Link's model, but definitely not all of it. And you can tell the polygon additions are limited because the higher resolution highlights how blocky the game is. The textures also fall victim to this at points. The higher resolution means that effects that were placed on objects in the distance to make them look like paint are still present, but scaled down significantly. Textures are much clearer throughout the game, and this highlights how limited the details of them are. I'm not saying this here to say Skyward Sword HD doesn't look better than the original. It definitely does, but it absolutely does not hide its age. Rather, it looks like it was running through an emulator. If you think I'm being too harsh, I completely understand, but I would like to point out that the game's graphics actually are run through an emulator. While most of the code runs natively on the Switch, the visuals do not. It's just an upscale of the Wii's graphics through an emulator. This is objectively the least amount of effort put into the visual upgrades of any Zelda remake, paired with the least amount of changes to the gameplay. While there is very little change to the actual game's content and visuals, there is one dreadful decision that 4 years later I cannot get past. Skyward Sword had a significant problem with the fast travel. If you were in one zone but wanted to change area, you had to go to your nearest bird statue, launch into the sky, loop around in your loft wing, dive down, then pick a statue to land on. This is an absolute mess, and another way the sky feels forced into the game. Skyward Sword HD fixed one aspect of this. You didn't need to find a bird statue to get up into the sky, you could just walk on the spot. Everything else remained the same, so it's far from perfect. But what makes this decision so bad is that the entire feature was locked behind an amiibo. The amiibo can be intrusive in general. I don't like looking content behind figurines you have to buy. It's also annoying to always have to have the figure on hand to use these features. But amiibos can also be hard to find, and especially at the time of launch, these things sell out relatively quickly. So depending on when you got or are getting this remake, it can actually be a challenge to get hold of the fast travel upgrade. The most outrageous part of this is the pricing. Of course, the game and amiibo are priced differently in different regions, but in many places and over here, the amiibo was priced at 40% of the whole game. So if you actually wanted to play this remake with a tiny improvement to the fast travel, you had to pay 140% of the price of a AAA game. What in the actual hell were they thinking with this? Everyone is talking about how expensive Mario Kart World is at the moment, so to put this into perspective, it is cheaper to buy the digital version of Mario Kart World than it is to buy Skyward Sword HD with the Zelda amiibo. And this is separate from the conversation of whether or not this game should have been full price. Spoiler for that conversation, it should not be at all. If you thought that the Switch 2 upgrades for the new Zelda games were stingy, then charging full price for what is almost an emulated Wii game is outrageous. So yes, I get it, I am being very harsh, but for good reason. I am willing to criticize Skyward Sword. I'm willing to criticize it a lot, but I still have a strong love for it. Not only was it the first game I ever pre-ordered, all the way back in 2011, but it's also the first game I ever played before release at a convention. And there is no video game I have played from start to end as much as Skyward Sword, and trust me, it's a disgusting number. So, while I do know the deep flaws of the game inside out, I still think it deserved better than Skyward Sword HD. This didn't feel like a limited remake because it was too good to change anything. It felt like a limited remake because it wasn't good enough to be made from the ground up. To me, that's really sad. Needless to say, I found the latest 3D Zelda remakes to be a disappointment. I feel Twilight Princess HD was the minimum they should be able to get away with when remaking a Zelda game, but Skyward Sword HD found a lower bar. There's pretty much nothing added to the game outside of what's locked behind the amiibo, and instead there's only bits of dialogue that were incredibly annoying and intrusive which have now been cut. They also just didn't include what had become a standard in these remakes, which is allowing returning players to choose hero mode from the start. Just like the original, you can only access it once the game is completed. Both of these games just deserved better than what they got. The reason I hold the remakes of Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker so highly is because they made these timeless classics feel less aged. They felt like they belonged in the era that they were re-released in, because they're good enough games to belong there. This does carry importance. With the big gap in quality with these remakes, it does make you wonder if the company that handled them is the main factor here. The 3DS remakes were made by Grezzo, Wind Waker HD was Nintendo in-house, and Twilight Princess HD and Skyward Sword HD were made by Tantalus. We should also bring up the remake for Link's Awakening on Switch. Yes, there were minimal changes to it and some issues like the frame rate, but I don't think you can argue that they didn't try. This remake was also made by Grezzo, and was entirely made from the ground up, with new 3D graphics, models, sound, animations, the whole lot. Also, like most other remakes, returning players can use hero mode from the very start, and there's also a new little dungeon creator. This remake is often the one people say has the fewest changes to it, but the list of small quality of life changes they made is actually quite substantial. There are a ton of little changes to make the game more accessible, like being able to attack in 8 directions rather than 4, less scrolling in certain dungeons with the camera actually following Link, changing the map so dungeons become easier to tackle, symbols added in places so puzzle solutions are more obvious. Some items you get are now given their own buttons rather than needing to be equipped. Honestly, just a whole load of little changes that often go unnoticed. My point being, both graphics and gameplay were given a lot of care and attention. I'd put this one up there with the 3DS remakes in how high quality they are. The effort also paid off. The Link's Awakening remake almost sold 6.5 million units, which is nearly 2.5 more million units than Skyward Sword HD did. In fact, Grezzo has been so good at remaking Zelda games that they eventually developed a brand new one with Echoes of Wisdom. While I'm glad that they've earned these projects, I hope this doesn't mean that we're doomed to not get any more Grezzo remakes. The reason I wanted to talk about this now is because of the new generation of Zelda fans. While yes, people can use emulation to play whichever version of these games they wish, for many that's not an option and something that others just don't want to do. Most of these games are now playable via Nintendo Switch Online, but that doesn't fully solve this problem. Remakes are important in modernizing these games so that they're more accessible. We're in a different era of video games where people have so many options and don't want to spend weeks being stuck or frustrated, especially if it's because it feels old. We have to bear in mind that changes we don't like are only changes to fans that played the originals. A new player won't know these things are different, and they might make a first playthrough that much more engaging and enjoyable for them. And while this isn't something that I'm happy about, we have to consider, especially for the youngest of fans, games like Ocarina of Time just look a bit old. I could easily boot up the Wii Zelda games and have just as much fun with them as I would if they were 4K, ray-traced, 240 FPS, and a big part of why I can enjoy them either way is because I grew up with the games looking like they originally did. Unfortunately, people like good graphics. Sometimes dated graphics and choppy frame rates can deter people from playing a game. When I was born, Ocarina of Time on the N64 was just a couple of years old. I grew up watching my family play on the N64, so it never really looked that old to me, but it was still my idea of an older looking game. A teenager now getting into the Zelda games would have grown up in the 2010s, so imagine how old a game from the 90s would look and feel to them. So while it's great we can still play the originals on Switch, I have no doubt a remake of the game would draw a lot of new players in. The 3DS remakes featured significant visual upgrades, and I'd argue that Majora's Mask in particular stands out as one of the console's more visually impressive titles. But stepping away from graphics for a moment, we should also consider how gameplay itself has changed over the years. One example is combat. Think back to the early 2000s, the combat you would find in those games is nowhere near the standard of today. I don't think it's controversial to say that the general combat found in the earlier 3D Zelda games is far below what we're used to now. Kids are getting better at video games. That always has been and always will be the case. But some of the games kids are able to play now, I mean, God. But of course that's the case. The age where people are being exposed to video games and technology in general is getting younger and younger. So we have to bear in mind, when talking about a game that is over 26 years old, that maybe it's time to admit that more than just the graphics have aged for the modern audience. Combat is one of the main things that ages the gameplay of older Zelda entries, and we've seen remakes from other series that imagine old games and almost reinvent the gameplay from the ground up in the most incredible way. So is that where Zelda remakes need to go? These games are sometimes treated like temples that should never be touched. But would it be the end of the world if Ocarina of Time had a tiny change to its combat to modernize it? Even just adding in the parry from Skyward Sword, and even that game's almost 14 years old. This shouldn't be something that's controversial to say, but the precedent that Nintendo has set for their games and especially remakes almost makes the idea seem uncomfortable. There are barely any classic Nintendo games that ever get remakes. Most of the time, Nintendo is even funny about when they'll release ports. It feels like they're happy to just let games die on their console sometimes. While we can go on about how great Ocarina of Time 3D looked when it came out, that game is now older than the original game on the N64 was when the 3D remake was released. So I wouldn't be surprised if we eventually start getting second generation remakes. They could pick and choose the changes that players did and didn't like from the 3D versions, and while any new changes wouldn't be needed, I still think the proper remake treatment would be very impactful for newer players. Zelda games deserve that AAA remake treatment. Could you imagine if Ocarina of Time was remade for the Switch 2 and was visually up there with the other titles on the console, as well as having slightly more modern combat? I think that would really be something. You wouldn't have to do much to make Ocarina of Time one of the best games released that year, but I do feel you'd have to do something. A Zelda remake doesn't need to be made for me. I love Ocarina of Time to death, and I will happily keep playing the N64 version. A remake of an old Zelda game is something that I would love, but that doesn't mean it has to be made for me and players my age, and to be honest, I don't entirely think it should be. I'd rather it was made specifically for the newer generation of players, so that they can have that same amazing feeling when playing Ocarina of Time now that I had when I first experienced it as a kid. At the same time, I think I would also enjoy it if the game felt a little bit different, like a new experience, because I can play the original version whenever I want. That's something I really like about what they're doing with the Nintendo Switch Online collections. People should still have access to the originals, especially if a remake has significant changes. I want more people to play these classic Zelda games. I genuinely believe the level design holds up so well. In order to really sell these games to the next gen, I do believe effort needs to be put in to make them more accessible, and fit what games of this age can look and feel like. With the Zelda remakes we have now, there's a real distinction between the ones that did make this effort and those that still showed their age. Hopefully, Zelda remakes in the future will give these games the care that they deserve, so that they can stand alongside new games that are coming out now. I just want more people to experience the joy of the Zelda series as a whole.